he died. And the first thing that filled the air wasn't silence, it was fear. Thick, heavy, suffocating fear. You could taste it. You could feel it creeping into your skin. You could hear it in the whispers that followed every headline. Kirk was gone, assassinated in broad daylight. And almost immediately, people weren't just grieving, they were terrified. Afraid to speak, afraid to gather, afraid to trust. And that's when Jesus spoke to me. Not in the way I wanted, not with comfort first, but with words that cut straight through the panic. Do you see what fear does? This is the enemy's second weapon. Death was the first. Fear is the aftershock that keeps the wound bleeding. Kirk wasn't just another man. He was fire in the bones, a voice that refused to be quiet when everyone else decided silence was safer. He wasn't perfect. Lord knows he rubbed people the wrong way. But he was brave. Brave enough to step into storms. Brave enough to call out lies. Brave enough to stand where others ran. And that bravery is what made him a target. The night before his assassination, he called me. His voice was steady, but I could hear something in it, a weariness, maybe even a foreboding. If anything happens, he said, promise me you'll tell them not to be afraid. Promise me you won't let my death become their silence. I laughed nervously, told him nothing was going to happen. But deep down, a chill settled in my gut. And then it did. Shots in the street, chaos, siren, the kind of scene you only see in movies, except this was real. And it ended with my friend bleeding out on the ground. I still see his eyes when I close mine, wide, searching, but not panicked. Almost as if he already knew this was how it would end. In the days that followed, fear spread faster than the news itself. Friends who used to gather openly now whispered in small corners. Neighbors who once waved from porches stayed inside, blinds closed. People who had followed Kirk's words suddenly erased posts, deleted videos, pretended they had never known him. Fear swallowed them whole. And that's when Jesus came to me. I was alone, curled on the floor of my living room, shaking from grief and rage, when I felt his presence settle around me like a weight. He said, "Do you see, death may silence one man, but fear silences nations." The bullet was not the end, it was the beginning of the echo. And the echo is what the enemy wants. I froze. Because it was true. Kirk's death had ended his voice, but it had multiplied the whispers of fear. Suddenly, the air was thick with paranoia. Who's next? Who's watching? Who's safe anymore? And I realized that was the real assassination. Not just of one man, but of courage itself. I started to notice it everywhere. At the grocery store, people whispered instead of speaking. In churches, leaders skipped over his name, too afraid to stir controversy. Online, people shared safer words, watered-down versions of the truth, as if courage had been buried with Kirk. One night, I asked Jesus, "Why show me this if I can't stop it? I'm just one man. Fear is too big." And he answered, "Because fear feeds on silence. Break the silence, and you break its hold." That answer wrecked me, because it meant I couldn't hide. It meant my grief wasn't just mine to carry. It was a weapon, a testimony, a light in the middle of the suffocating dark. The first time I spoke publicly after his assassination, I was terrified. My hands shook, my throat closed, my knees nearly gave out. But I remembered Kirk's words. "Promise me you won't let my death become their silence." So I stood in front of a crowd and said, "Yes, he died. But if we let fear take us too, then they killed more than a man. They killed us all." The room went still, and then something incredible happened. People wept. People prayed. People who had been silent for weeks began to speak again, softly at first, then stronger. Fear cracked, even if only for a moment. But the enemy didn't back off. Fear is stubborn. It showed up in threats, anonymous messages telling me I'd be next if I didn't shut up. It showed up in doubt, friends pulling away, saying I was reckless for speaking out. It showed up in despair, nights when I lay awake, heart pounding, certain that every sound outside was danger. And in those moments, Jesus would whisper again, "Fear is not your master. I am. Stand." So I stood, shaking, crying, sometimes begging for strength. but I stood. And as I did, I began to see what Jesus had meant about fear being the second weapon. Death kills one body, but fear kills countless voices. Death takes one life, but fear strangles entire communities. And if we let it, fear rewrites history, not as it was, but as the enemy wants it remembered. I began to tell people that in churches, in living rooms, even in hushed conversations with strangers, I'd say, "Don't you see? Fear is what they want. Fear is the silence after the shot. If you give in to it, you let the assassin win twice." And people's eyes would widen because deep down, they already knew it. But it wasn't just about Kirk. Jesus showed me something bigger. One night, I had a vision. I saw a great city, shining with lights. Then a shot rang out, and the lights began to flicker, one by one. Not because the power failed, but because the people inside turned them off themselves, too afraid to be seen. Darkness spread, not from the assassin's bullet, but from the fear that followed. And Jesus whispered, "This is your nation." One bullet sparked fear, but the people's own silence turned off the lights. "Will you turn yours back on?" I woke up sobbing, because I realized that was the real question. Not whether Kirk's death could be undone. It couldn't. But whether his courage would die with him, or live through us. So I keep telling his story. I tell them about his bravery. Yes, but also his fear. Because even Kirk was human. He told me once, "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's refusing to let fear drive." That's what he lived, and that's what he died for. And every time I speak, I feel Jesus pushing me to go further. To not just mourn Kirk, but to expose fear for what it is, a lie dressed up as protection, a chain disguised as wisdom, a shadow that looks bigger than it is, but shrinks the second light touches it. He died, but in his death, Jesus showed me the truth. Fear is the real assassin, and if we don't break its hold, more lives will be lost, not to bullets, but to silence. That's only the beginning of what he revealed. Because the fear that followed Kirk's assassination didn't just paralyze individuals. It began reshaping entire communities, poisoning leaders, corrupting conversations, and silencing truth. And what Jesus showed me about that was even heavier to carry. And if you're still with me, if you're still listening through the grief and the fire, then maybe you're ready to hear the rest. After the first weeks of shock, when the news cycle moved on and the headlines shifted to something else, the fear didn't leave. It lingered like smoke after a fire. You could still smell it in the air. People stopped asking why and started asking who's next. That was the atmosphere, and it's hard to explain just how heavy it was. It was like every corner, every shadow carried suspicion. That's when Jesus spoke again and said, "Do you see how fear multiplies itself? One death, one act of violence, becomes 1,000 chains in the minds of those who weren't even touched by the bullet." I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. Fear had crawled into my own chest. I checked the locks twice before bed, avoided familiar places, even pulled my cap low in crowds, as if hiding could save me. I hated myself for it, because I knew Kirk wouldn't have lived that way. But fear doesn't ask permission, it creeps in, and once it's in, it whispers day and night. One evening, I walked into church, and the pews that used to overflow were half empty. People whispered excuses, too tired, too busy, but I could see it in their eyes. They were afraid to gather, afraid of being seen, afraid of being next. And that's when Jesus leaned close and whispered, "Fear is discipling them more than I am. Who will teach them otherwise, if not you?" That question shook me, because I realized fear isn't passive. It trains people. It shapes their habits. It becomes their God, if they let it. And if you want proof, just look around after tragedy. How quickly people build routines around avoidance instead of courage. So I began speaking about it openly, not with polished sermons or careful language, but with trembling honesty. I told them, I'm afraid too. Every day I wake up with a knot in my chest. Every night I hear noises that aren't there, but I refuse to let fear write the story. Because if we give in, then Kirk's death becomes a victory for the enemy twice over. Some nodded, some wept, some shook their heads as if I was asking too much. But slowly, a few people started showing up again. They prayed louder, sang braver, held hands instead of shrinking back. And I realized fear can spread like a virus, but so can courage. But Jesus didn't stop there. He began showing me how fear wasn't just personal. It was systemic. It slipped into leaders too. I had a vision one night of a council chamber. Leaders sat around a table, their faces pale. Every decision they made was shaped not by wisdom, but by fear. If we say this, they'll attack us. If we stand here, they'll come for us. Better to say nothing, better to do nothing. And in the corner, shadows grinned, feeding on their paralysis. Jesus said, "Do you see? Fear has hijacked leadership. And when leaders bow to fear, the people suffer twice, once from tragedy, and again from cowardice." That revelation burned me, because I saw it happening in real life. Leaders avoiding Kirk's name, erasing his story, pretending neutrality was virtue, and yet all it did was deepen the silence. I understood then why Jesus called fear the second weapon. It doesn't just haunt individuals. It infects entire systems until silence looks like safety and truth looks like risk. So I kept speaking, even when my voice shook. I told people, fear is not wisdom. Fear is not caution. Fear is not God. Fear is a liar. And if we bow to it, we lose more than one man. We lose ourselves. But the more I spoke, the more pushback came. Some said I was reckless, that I was inviting trouble. One night, I found a note under my door, "Stay quiet, or you'll join him." I sat there, holding it, hands trembling, wondering if I was insane to keep going. That's when Jesus whispered, "They're not threatening your life, they're threatening your silence. And silence is what they really want." That snapped me back. Because I realized the assassin's bullet wasn't aimed at Kirk alone. It was aimed at all of us, at our courage, at our willingness to speak. And every time we silenced ourselves, we pulled the trigger again. The most powerful moment came weeks later at a gathering we held in the town square. People were hesitant, but we lit candles and read aloud the words Kirk had spoken in his last public address. His widow stood there, holding the microphone with shaking hands, and said through tears, "They took him from me, but they will not take my voice. They will not take yours." The crowd erupted, not in violence, not in rage, but in something stronger, in defiance against fear. I'll never forget the sound. It was like chains snapping all around me. That's when Jesus spoke the clearest. This is how fear is defeated. Not by denial, not by pretending it doesn't exist, but by standing together in spite of it. By making the choice to keep the lights on when darkness wants you to hide. I carried that with me, still do, because I learned the hard way that fear doesn't vanish, it waits. It circles back when you're tired, when you're alone, when you think you've beaten it. But every time it comes, I remember Kirk's words, and I remember Jesus' revelation. Fear is not just an emotion, it's a battlefield, and you fight it not once, but every day, with every choice to speak instead of staying silent, to gather instead of scattering, to hope instead of despairing. He died. But what Jesus told me about the fear that followed saved me from burying my own voice beside him. Fear wanted to be the assassin's accomplice. It wanted to make his death the beginning of our silence. But instead, by the grace of God, it became the beginning of our testimony. That's why I tell you this now, not because it's easy, not because I don't still shake sometimes, but because I know someone out there is living in that same fear, and you need to hear me say, it doesn't own you, it doesn't define you, and it doesn't get the last word.